There's a question most people never ask out loud, even though it quietly shapes the foundations of their lives. Why do religions exist in the first place? Not whether they're true, not whether they're good, but why they were ever created at all. This question pulls at the roots of human civilization, because for something to have lasted this long, through centuries of war, empire, science, and social change, there had to be something powerful behind it. But that power wasn't divine, it was psychological. Religion wasn't born from revelation, it was born from fear. Fear of death, fear of suffering, fear of the unknown. When early humans looked up at the night sky, they saw mystery. When their children died of illness, they saw chaos. When floods destroyed their food or lightning struck from nowhere, they had no answer. And the mind cannot survive without answers. It invents them if it must. And so the first gods were not gods of love or wisdom. They were gods of weather, war, fertility, and death. They were attempts to explain suffering, to control what could not be controlled. The storm didn't just happen. A spirit was angry. The drought wasn't random. Someone sinned. The world didn't feel random anymore. It became personal. And in that, people found a fragile sense of security. But religion offered more than just explanations. It offered hierarchy. In a tribe, whoever claimed to speak to the gods gained influence. The shaman wasn't just a healer, he was a gatekeeper of divine will. As societies grew, that role expanded. Priests, prophets, pharaohs, popes, those who spoke on behalf of gods were no longer just storytellers. They were lawmakers. They were kings. Religion became the earliest form of social control. When laws weren't written, commandments were. When jails didn't exist, eternal hells were invented. Fear of divine punishment did what human force couldn't. It shaped behavior through invisible surveillance. God was the original spy, watching not only what you did, but what you thought. And that was the genius of it. Religions didn't just control actions. They colonized the mind. If you could convince people that their suffering had meaning, that obedience led to reward, that pain was noble, you could control them without chains. You could make them love their prison. Martyrdom became virtue, guilt became worship, and submission became holiness. This wasn't always done maliciously. In many cases, the people spreading these beliefs genuinely believed them. They needed to, because if the religion wasn't true, then the suffering was senseless. The sacrifices were wasted. The gods were silent. And silence is terrifying. So religion evolved, it adapted, it absorbed local customs, rewrote old myths, renamed deities. Christianity didn't erase paganism, it dressed in its clothes. Islam didn't invent a new moral system, it borrowed from the ones before it, and all of them recycled one powerful idea. You are broken, but we have the cure. This is where religion became not just explanatory or political, but psychological. It targeted the deepest insecurities of the human condition, the feeling of guilt, the fear of meaninglessness, the longing for order in a chaotic world. It promised certainty where none existed, and it packaged this certainty in rituals, symbols, and stories that bypass logic and go straight to emotion. And once it embedded itself in culture, it began to feed on itself. Children born into faiths didn't choose them, they inherited them. And because questioning them became taboo, religions gained immunity. You could doubt yourself, but you could not doubt the sacred. This is how falsehoods survive, not by being convincing, but by being untouchable. Over time, religion became the foundation for identity, not just spiritual, but political, ethnic, national. To attack the faith was to attack the tribe, and so wars were fought not just with weapons, but with gods. Crusades, jihads, inquisitions. all justified by divine command. If your God was true, every act in His name was holy, even murder. And yet, religion still promised peace, still promised love, still promised eternal reward, but only after death. The real world didn't need to be fixed, only endured. The poor were told they'd inherit heaven. The slaves were told to obey their masters. The women were told to serve their husbands. And the suffering were told not to rebel, but to pray. This is the most devastating legacy of religion. It teaches people to accept injustice as destiny. But the true origin of religion has nothing to do with justice. It has everything to do with survival. Early humans didn't invent religion to control people. They invented it to survive the terror of their own awareness. The human brain evolved far enough to understand its own mortality, but not far enough to accept it. And so it created stories. Stories that blurred death into transition, chaos into plan, and suffering into virtue. And those stories became sacred. But a sacred story is still a story. And as humanity progressed, some began to see the cracks. Science didn't just explain the weather. It explained disease. It explained time. It explained matter. It didn't need angels or demons to do it. And slowly the gods of gaps began to disappear. But religion didn't disappear. It adapted again. It softened, rebranded, became more symbolic, more personal. But the core remained the same, a system that claims to have answers without proof and demands obedience without question. That is why religions were created, not because they are true, but because people needed something to be. But needing something to be true doesn't make it true. And the more we examine the roots of religion, the more we find human fingerprints all over them. Flawed, frightened, imaginative fingerprints. Look at the patterns across cultures. Nearly every ancient civilization developed a concept of a divine lawgiver, a creator, an afterlife. These patterns aren't evidence that they were all accessing the same truth. They're evidence that human minds, under similar pressures, created similar solutions. When you fear death, you invent eternity. When you feel powerless, you invent divine justice. When you feel alone, you invent a God who sees you. Religion is a mirror, not of the divine, but of human longing. And what do people long for most? Belonging, purpose, certainty, and answers. Even bad answers are more comforting than none. This is why religion was created, not out of malice but out of desperation. A desperate attempt to explain the unexplainable, to soften the unbearable, and to create meaning where none was visible. It's important to realize religion didn't begin as doctrine, it began as story. Oral traditions passed down around fires, told to children, shaped by fear, hope, and the desire to not be forgotten. These stories were sticky. They evolved with each generation, growing more structured, more mythologized. And once writing appeared, they became locked in scripture. But once a story is written down and declared holy, it becomes more than a story, it becomes law. And that's when religion took its most dangerous turn, from comfort to control. When a belief system claims to be beyond question, it is no longer just belief, it is power. And power always finds a way to protect itself. Over centuries, religions built structures around themselves, institutions, hierarchies, rituals, to guard their authority. And those who challenged that authority were branded as heretics, blasphemers, infidels. Questioning wasn't just dangerous, it was punishable. Why? Because once people begin to question the roots of religion, they realize that its authority doesn't come from any divine source. It comes from tradition, repetition, and emotional manipulation. This is the part few are willing to admit. The feeling of sacredness is not proof of truth. It's a psychological response, a learned reaction. You were taught what is sacred. You were trained to feel reverence, and anything that disrupts that feeling, anything that asks uncomfortable questions, feels like an attack. But questioning is not violence, it's freedom. Freedom from guilt you didn't earn, from rules you didn't agree to, from fears that were planted in you before you could even understand them. Religions were created to answer fears, but too often they end up feeding them. You fear death? Religion promises immortality, but only if you obey. You fear being alone? Religion gives you a God who listens, but only if you pray the right way. You fear chaos? Religion gives you a moral order, but one that punishes deviation, even when that deviation is kindness, reason, or love. These are not answers. They are conditions. And conditions dressed as love are a form of emotional blackmail. This is the darker side of why religion was created, to make obedience feel virtuous, to make conformity feel moral, and to make critical thinking feel like betrayal. And it works. People don't defend religion because they've examined it and found it flawless. They defend it because it's woven into their identity. Pull that thread, and they fear everything else might unravel. But this is how you know religion is man-made. It behaves like every other man-made institution. It wants loyalty, discourages dissent, adapts when threatened, and punishes those who walk away. That's not the behavior of a divine truth. That's the behavior of an ideology. The difference between religion and other ideologies, however, is that it reaches deeper. It trains children before they can reason. It attaches moral value to belief itself. And it creates fear around the idea of leaving, fear of hell, fear of exile, fear of losing love, family, community. This is not spiritual guidance. This is psychological conditioning. But again, this isn't always done with cruelty. Most believers are sincere. They truly believe they're helping others. But sincerity doesn't equal truth. A person can be honest and still be wrong, and an entire society can be built on sincerity and still be deceived. This is what makes questioning religion so difficult. You're not just questioning an idea, you're questioning the emotional architecture of entire lives. And yet, that's exactly why it must be questioned. Because if religion can't survive honest questions, it doesn't deserve your reverence. If it needs to threaten eternal punishment to keep you faithful, that's not love. That's coercion. If it can't tolerate curiosity, it's not a path to truth. It's a barrier to it. And if it tells you that your pain is part of a divine plan, that your doubts are sins, that your desire to understand is rebellion, then it is not on your side. It is not offering freedom. It is demanding submission. That's why religion was created. Not to set people free, but to help them feel comfortable in their chains. So what happens when those chains begin to rust? When people start to notice the contradictions? When the old explanations no longer work in a world that's no longer afraid of thunder or eclipses or disease? For many, the answer is denial. Cling harder, pray more, blame the world, not the belief. But for others, the disillusionment opens a door, not just to atheism or secularism, but to clarity, to the terrifying and liberating possibility that the universe is not built to serve us, that there is no script, that life is not a test, and that meaning is something we create, not something we are given. This realization is frightening, because religion has trained people to fear a world without a master. But freedom doesn't require a master. It requires courage. The courage to accept uncertainty. The courage to live ethically without bribes or threats. The courage to admit that the stories we were told may have been beautiful, but they were still stories. And when you look back at the origins of religion with honest eyes, that's what you see. Beautiful stories, born from pain and wonder and fear. Stories that tried to make sense of existence. Stories that offered hope when there was none. But also stories that were hijacked, weaponized, hardened into dogma, and used to control, divide, and exploit. You see the pattern, not because it's hidden, but because it's everywhere. Every time a religion claims exclusivity over truth, you see it. Every time someone is shamed or cast out or threatened for doubting, you see it. Every time a child is taught to hate themselves because of who they are, or to love a God who would torture them if they didn't believe, you see it. This is not ancient, it's current, it's happening right now, in homes, schools, governments, and lives. And it traces back not to divine will, but to the simple, human desire for certainty. Because when people are afraid, they don't want truth, they want comfort, and religion has mastered the art of offering both, while delivering only one. But truth doesn't require belief. It doesn't demand worship. It doesn't punish questions. It stands whether we acknowledge it or not. And that's what makes it terrifying and beautiful. So why were religions created? They were created to explain what we couldn't understand, to comfort what we couldn't bear, to control what we couldn't predict, and to unite people through a shared illusion of purpose. But we are no longer in caves. We no longer need to whisper stories to calm the night. We have science to explain the stars, psychology to understand our minds, and one another to ease our pain. We are not alone. We are not children, and we do not need to be lied to in order to be good. The time for sacred myths has passed. What we need now is honesty about where we came from, what we fear, and what we still don't know. We need to outgrow the systems that keep us small, ashamed, and afraid, not with anger, but with understanding, not with hatred, but with clarity. Because once you see why religions were created, you can begin to forgive the past and move beyond it, not into nihilism, but into freedom, into responsibility, into a life that is meaningful not because it was written in a book, but because you are writing it every day. And in that realization, there is something more powerful than faith. There is awareness, not the kind that blinds you with certainty, but the kind that humbles you with wonder. Because the truth is, we don't need gods to make life sacred. We just need to see it clearly, to face it bravely, and to live it fully, without fear, without guilt, and without permission.